They found her behind the general store in a blizzard, a woman with two shivering children, no food, no money, and nowhere left to run. She'd walked 300 miles from Kansas, fleeing debts she didn't owe and men who didn't care. When the stranger on horseback asked her name, she couldn't answer through her frozen tears. He didn't ask again, he just said, "Come here, all of you," and led them into the storm toward a ranch that had forgotten warmth. That November night, survival wasn't a choice. It was mercy offered by a man who'd lost everything too. If you're watching from somewhere warm tonight, drop your city in the comments below. I want to see how far this story travels, from frozen frontier to your screen. The snow came down like judgment. It wasn't the soft Christmas card kind that dusted rooftops and made children smile. This was Montana Territory snow in late November. Thick, blinding, merciless. It turned the world into a white nothing, erased the horizon, and swallowed sound until even your own breathing felt foreign. The wind howled through the timber town of Ashford like a living thing, rattling shutters, bending pines, and driving every soul indoors except those too desperate or too foolish to take shelter. Miriam Dale was neither desperate nor foolish. She was simply out of choices. She crouched behind the clapboard wall of Harmon's general store, her back pressed against rough wood that offered no warmth, her arms wrapped around her two children. Ben, 9 years old, sat rigid beside her, his thin shoulders squared like he was trying to be the man she kept telling him he didn't have to be yet. Little Lila, barely 5, was tucked against Miriam's chest, her face buried in the folds of a coat that had long since lost its ability to keep anyone warm. The alley stank of rotting vegetables and horse manure, but it blocked the worst of the wind. That was all Miriam could ask for now. "Mama," Ben whispered, his voice barely audible over the storm. "How long do we wait?" Miriam closed her eyes. How long? She didn't know. She'd been asking herself that same question for 3 months, since the fever took Thomas, since the wagon burned, since the bank in Kansas sent men with papers and guns to collect debts her husband had kept hidden from her. "Not long," she lied, brushing snow from Ben's hair. "Just until the storm eases." It wouldn't ease. Not tonight. Maybe not for days. Lila whimpered, and Miriam pulled her closer, feeling the fragile bones of her daughter's back through layers of threadbare fabric. The child hadn't eaten since yesterday morning, a crust of bread Miriam had begged from a farmer's wife 2 towns back. Ben had refused his share, claiming he wasn't hungry, though his hollow cheeks told a different story. Miriam's own stomach had stopped complaining days ago. Now it just ached, a dull constant throb that she'd learned to ignore. She heard voices from inside the store, muffled, warm, alive. Laughter. The clink of coins. The scent of coffee drifted through the cracks in the wall, so rich and cruel it made her throat tighten. She'd tried the front door 2 hours ago, before the snow got bad. Mr. Harmon had taken one look at her, muddy skirts, wild hair, children clinging to her sides, and shaken his head. "Can't help you, ma'am. Got no charity work available, and I don't extend credit to strangers." "I'm not asking for credit," Miriam had said, hating the tremor in her voice. "Just a day's work. I can clean. I can—" "Stores close for the season come Monday," Harmon interrupted, already turning away. "Try the church." She had. Father Greaves was visiting a dying parishioner 20 miles north and wouldn't return until Sunday. The housekeeper had offered prayers, but no beds. So here she was, behind the store, waiting for a storm to end or her children to freeze, whichever came first. The wind shifted, driving snow into the alley with renewed fury. Lila coughed, a wet, rattling sound that stabbed through Miriam's chest like a blade. Not her. Please God, not her. Thomas had started with a cough, just like that. "Mama." Ben's hand found hers in the darkness. His fingers were ice. "Maybe we should knock again. Maybe if we—" "No." The word came out sharper than she intended. Ben flinched, and guilt flooded through her, but Miriam couldn't take it back. She couldn't walk to that door again and see pity or disgust or worse, nothing at all, in another stranger's eyes. She was so tired of begging, so tired of walking, so tired of being the woman people looked through like she was already a ghost. The storm howled. Lila's coughing worsened. Ben sat silent and shivering, trying so hard to be brave that it broke something in Miriam she hadn't known was still whole. She pressed her face against Lila's hair and prayed, Not for salvation or miracles or any of the grand things Father Greaves used to preach about. She just prayed for morning, for one more sunrise where her children were still breathing. That was all she had left to ask for. She didn't hear the horse until it was nearly on top of them. The hoofbeats were muffled by snow, soft and rhythmic, and by the time Miriam realized someone was coming, it was too late to hide. She pulled Ben and Lila closer, making herself as small as possible in the shadows, hoping whoever it was would pass without noticing 3 more pieces of frontier wreckage huddled in the dark. The horse stopped. Miriam held her breath. A man's voice cut through the wind, low and rough. "You planning to freeze to death back there, or you just like the scenery?" Her heart hammered. She didn't answer. The sound of boots hitting frozen ground, slow, deliberate steps crunching through snow. Then a figure emerged at the mouth of the alley, a tall silhouette backlit by the dim glow of the store's lanterns. He didn't move closer, just stood there, studying them. Miriam couldn't see his face, but she felt his gaze like a weight. She tightened her grip on her children, ready to run even though there was nowhere to go. "Got a name?" the man asked. Miriam's throat closed. She shook her head. "Kids got names?" Ben stirred beside her, but Miriam squeezed his hand, a silent command to stay quiet. The man was quiet for a long moment. Then he sighed, a sound heavy with something Miriam couldn't name. "All right, don't need names tonight." He turned and walked back toward his horse. Relief crashed through Miriam so hard her knees nearly buckled. He was leaving. They were safe. She just had to... "Come here." She froze. The man was untying something from his saddle, a rolled blanket, thick wool that looked like it had never known cold. He shook it out and held it toward the alley without looking back. "Storm's getting worse," he said. "You stay out here. Those kids won't see morning. Neither will you." Miriam didn't move. Every instinct screamed that this was a trap, that men who offered help always wanted something in return, that she'd learned this lesson too many times to forget it now. But Lila coughed again, and Ben's shivering had turned violent, and Miriam realized with crushing clarity that pride and caution were luxuries she couldn't afford anymore. She stood, pulling her children up with her. Ben looked at her with wide, uncertain eyes. Lila buried her face against Miriam's shoulder. The man still hadn't turned around. He just stood there holding the blanket, waiting. Miriam took one step forward, then another. When she reached him, he draped the blanket over her shoulders without a word. It was warm, impossibly warm, like it had been sitting by a fire. Miriam wrapped it around all 3 of them and felt Lila's shivering ease just slightly. "Got a place 2 miles east," the man said, finally looking at her. In the dim light, she could see his face now, weathered, maybe 40, with a dark beard and eyes that held no anger but no softness either, just exhaustion. The kind that came from carrying too much for too long. "Shed's empty," he continued. "Stove works. You can sleep there tonight, figure out the rest in the morning." Miriam found her voice, though it came out raw. "Why?" He glanced at Ben, at Lila, then back at Miriam. "Because I got a shed and you don't." It wasn't kindness in his tone, just fact. He moved toward his horse, a sturdy bay mare that stood patient in the storm. "Can you walk 2 miles?" Miriam thought of the 300 they'd already walked from Kansas. "Yes." "Then follow me. Stay close. Snow's deep and the wind'll try to take you off the trail." He swung into the saddle with the ease of a man who'd spent more of his life on horseback than off it. Then he looked down at them one more time. "And stop looking at me like I'm going to hurt you," he said quietly. "If I wanted to do that, I'd have done it already." He nudged the mare forward into the storm. Miriam stood there for 3 heartbeats, weighing impossible choices with a mind too tired to think straight. Then she felt Ben's hand slip into hers, small and trusting, and the decision made itself. She pulled the blanket tighter around her children and followed the stranger into the blizzard. But the 2 miles felt like 20. The man, he still hadn't offered his name, rode slowly, his horse breaking trail through snow that reached past Miriam's knees. She stumbled more times than she could count, each time certain she'd fall and not get back up, but Ben was always there, his thin arm around her waist, pulling her forward. "We're almost there, Mama," he kept saying. Just a little more. She didn't know if he believed it or if he was just trying to convince himself. Lila had stopped coughing. That should have been a relief, but the silence scared Miriam more. The child was too still, too quiet, her breath coming in shallow gasps that barely fogged the air. The wind screamed around them, turning the world into a white chaos where up and down lost meaning. Miriam kept her eyes locked on the dark shape of the horse ahead, afraid that if she looked away for even a second, she'd lose him and they'd wander until the cold took them. Just when she thought her legs would give out, the man raised his hand. There. Through the snow, Miriam saw a darker shape emerging. A small ranch house, low and solid, with a barn and a shed huddled nearby. No lights burned in the windows, but smoke rose from the chimney, a gray ribbon against white sky. The man dismounted and led his horse toward the barn. "Shed's that one," he said, pointing. "I'll get the stove going." He disappeared into the barn with his horse, and Miriam stood in the yard, swaying slightly, unsure if this was real or if she'd finally collapsed back in that alley, and this was just her mind's last kindness before the end. Ben tugged her hand. "Mama?" She blinked, looked down at his face, so pale and frightened and brave all at once. "We're here," she whispered. "We made it." The man emerged from the barn carrying an armload of firewood. He jerked his head toward the shed. Inside. The shed was small, barely 10 feet square, but it was solid. No holes in the roof, no gaps in the walls. A small iron stove sat in one corner, a narrow cot in another, and a few shelves lined one wall holding various tools and supplies. The man knelt by the stove and began building a fire with quick, efficient movements. Within minutes, flames were crackling, orange light spilling across the space. Heat. Actual, blessed heat. Miriam sank onto the cot, still holding Lila, and felt something inside her crack. Not break. She'd been broken too many times to break again. Just crack, like ice under spring sun. Ben stood in the doorway, uncertain, until the man glanced at him. "Close the door, boy. You're letting the cold in." Ben obeyed immediately, then stood with his back against the wall, watching the stranger with wary eyes. The man fed more wood into the stove, then straightened. "Food's in the house. I'll bring something." "You don't have to," Miriam started. "Didn't ask what I had to do." He moved toward the door, then paused. "Don't leave. Storm's bad enough to kill you before you made it back to town." He left, shutting the door behind him. Miriam sat in the sudden quiet, listening to the fire pop and Lila's ragged breathing and the wind rattling the walls. Ben crept closer and sat on the floor by the stove, holding his hands toward the flames. "Mama," he said softly, "is this real?" She wanted to say yes, wanted to promise him that they were safe now, that the nightmare was over, that this stranger was different from all the others who'd turned them away. But she'd made too many promises she couldn't keep. "I don't know," she said honestly. "But we're warm. That's real." Ben nodded slowly, like he understood that warm was all they could count on right now. The door opened again, bringing a gust of cold air, and the man, with a covered pot in one hand and a canteen in the other. He set both on the floor by the stove. "Stew," he said. "Not fancy, but it'll keep you alive. Water's fresh from this morning." He turned to go, but Miriam found her voice. "Wait." He stopped but didn't turn around. "Thank you," she said. I can't pay you. I don't have anything to—" "Didn't ask for payment." "Then why?" He looked back at her then, his face unreadable in the firelight. "Because somebody did the same for me once. Long time ago." He left before she could respond. The stew was simple: beef, potatoes, carrots, all soft and warm, and more delicious than anything Miriam could remember tasting. She fed Lila first, spooning small bites into her daughter's mouth, relieved when the child swallowed without choking. Ben ate with both hands, barely pausing to breathe, and Miriam had to stop him twice to keep him from making himself sick. When he finally slowed down, his eyes were wet. "It's okay, Mama," he whispered. "You can eat too." She did, forcing herself to go slow even though her body screamed for more. The warmth spread through her chest, her limbs, chasing away the deep cold that had settled into her bones weeks ago. When the pot was empty, Miriam set it aside and pulled both children onto the cot with her. The blanket the man had given them was still wrapped around their shoulders, and the stove filled the shed with steady heat. For the first time in months, Miriam felt her body relax. Ben's breathing evened out almost immediately, exhaustion claiming him. Lila curled against Miriam's chest, her cough quieting to occasional, softer fits. Miriam stared at the ceiling, watching shadows dance from the firelight, and tried to make sense of what had happened. A stranger had found them in a storm and brought them to shelter, fed them, asked for nothing. It felt impossible. It felt like a trap. It felt like the first mercy anyone had shown them since Thomas died. She didn't know which instinct to trust anymore. The fire crackled. The wind howled, and Miriam Dale, widow, mother, survivor, closed her eyes and let sleep take her before she could talk herself into running back into the storm. She woke to pale gray light filtering through a gap in the shed's door. For one confused moment, she didn't know where she was. Then memory crashed back, the storm, the stranger, the impossible warmth of this tiny shelter. Ben and Lila were still asleep, tangled together under the blanket. The stove had burned down to embers, but the air was still warm enough that Miriam could see her breath only faintly. Morning. They'd survived another night. She sat up slowly, careful not to wake the children, and rubbed her face. Her body ached everywhere, feet, legs, back, shoulders. 3 months of walking, sleeping on hard ground, carrying Lila when the child couldn't walk anymore. But they were alive. The door opened and Miriam jerked back, heart racing. The man stood in the doorway, holding another pot. He glanced at the children, then at Miriam, his expression as unreadable as it had been last night. "Porridge," he said, setting the pot down. "Coffee's in the house if you want it." He turned to leave. "Wait," Miriam said again. "I need to know, what do you want from us?" He paused, his back to her. "Want?" "Yes." She stood, wrapping her arms around herself. "You gave us shelter, food. Men don't do that for nothing, so what do you want? Because I need to know now, before my children wake up, what you expect in return." He turned slowly, and for the first time she saw something flicker in his eyes. Not anger, not offense, just weariness. "Lady," he said quietly, "all I expect is that you don't freeze to death in my shed. Past that, I don't care what you do." "Then why help us at all?" He studied her for a long moment, and Miriam forced herself to hold his gaze, even though every instinct told her to look away. "You got a name?" he asked finally. She hesitated. Names made things real, made them harder to run from. "Miriam," she said. "Miriam Dale. These are my children, Ben and Lila." He nodded once. "Wyatt Carver. This is my land." "How much land?" "Enough." "And you live here alone? That a problem?" "I'm just trying to understand." "Oh, you're trying to figure out if I'm going to hurt you," Wyatt interrupted, his voice flat. "Answer's no. But you don't got to believe me. Stay the day if you want, or leave when the snow clears. Makes no difference to me." He started toward the door again. "Mr. Carver." He stopped but didn't turn around. "I can work," Miriam said quickly. "I can cook, clean, mend clothes. I'm strong, and Ben's a good worker too. If you let us stay just until the road's clear, I'll earn our keep. I won't be charity." "You already are charity," Wyatt said, "but I got work needs doing if you want to feel useful." Relief flooded through her so suddenly, her knees nearly buckled. "Yes, thank you. Start with the henhouse," he interrupted. "Chickens need feeding, eggs need collecting. Ben can haul water from the well. Stove in the main house needs wood. You do that today, we'll talk about tomorrow when tomorrow comes." "Yes, sir." Wyatt finally looked back at her, something unreadable in his eyes. "And stop calling me sir. Name's Wyatt." He left before she could respond. The work was hard but honest. The henhouse was a small structure behind the barn, half buried in snow. Inside, a dozen chickens clucked and scratched, ruffled and irritable from being cooped up during the storm. Miriam scattered feed from the bucket Wyatt had left by the door and collected eggs carefully, finding 7 in various nests. She hadn't worked with chickens since she was a girl on her father's farm in Ohio, but the rhythms came back to her, gentle movements, soft voice, respect for creatures that could peck hard when they wanted to. When she emerged from the henhouse, she found Ben already hauling water from the well, his thin arms straining with the weight of the bucket. Wyatt stood nearby, watching without helping, and Miriam almost snapped at him. The boy was too small for that kind of work. But then she saw the way Wyatt nodded when Ben successfully set the bucket down without spilling it, saw the way Ben's chest puffed with pride, and she understood. Her son needed to feel useful, needed to feel like he was protecting his family, even if the only thing he was protecting them from was thirst. "Good," Wyatt said simply. Again. Ben grinned and went back to the well. Lila stayed in the shed, curled under the blanket, watching through the open door. Her cough was better this morning, less frequent, less wet. But she was still too weak to do more than sit up. Miriam worked through the morning, falling into the rhythm of ranch life like she'd never left it. She hauled wood for the stove, swept snow from the porch, and when Wyatt brought out a basket of mending that looked like it hadn't been touched in years, she sat on a bench near the barn and worked through torn shirts and holey socks, while the winter sun struggled through clouds. Wyatt moved around the property with the efficiency of a man who'd done this alone for so long he'd forgotten what it was like to have help. He mucked stalls, repaired a broken fence rail, and worked on his horse's hooves with patient care. He didn't talk unless spoken to, and even then his answers were short. But he wasn't cruel. When Ben stumbled and spilled water, Wyatt just said, "Happens," and handed him an empty bucket. When Lila ventured out of the shed, wrapped in the blanket, he brought her a piece of hardtack and a cup of warm milk without being asked. By late afternoon, Miriam was exhausted but satisfied. The eggs were stored, the wood was stacked, the water was hauled, and she'd mended 6 shirts and 4 pairs of socks. Wyatt appeared from the barn and looked over her work without comment. Then he jerked his head toward the house. "Supper's in an hour. You can eat in the kitchen." He walked toward the house, and Miriam gathered her children and followed, uncertain but no longer terrified. The inside of Wyatt's house was spare but clean. One main room served as both kitchen and sitting area, with a large stone fireplace dominating one wall and a simple wooden table in the center. A doorway led to what Miriam assumed was a bedroom, but the door was closed. The house felt empty in a way that had nothing to do with lack of furniture. It was the emptiness of a place where one person had lived alone for too long, where routines had replaced life. Wyatt worked at the stove, his back to them, and Miriam stood awkwardly near the door with Ben and Lila pressed against her sides. "Sit," Wyatt said without turning around. They sat. He brought plates of fried venison, boiled potatoes, and beans, setting them on the table with no ceremony. Then he sat across from them and ate in silence. Miriam waited for him to speak, to ask questions, to make demands. He didn't. He just ate steadily, his eyes on his plate, and when he finished, he stood and carried his dishes to a wash basin near the stove. "There's a creek a quarter-mile south," he said, scraping his plate. "Water's good for drinking if you boil it first. Well, water's fine for washing and cooking. Outhouse is behind the shed. Keep the door latched or coyotes will get in." He set the plate aside and finally looked at them. "You can stay the winter if you need to," he said flatly. "Roads won't be clear for weeks, maybe months. You try to leave before spring, you'll die, so don't." Miriam's throat tightened. "Why would you let us stay that long?" "Because I ain't got a reason not to." "You don't even know us." "Don't need to." "But, Lady Miriam," he corrected himself, "I don't know what happened to you before you ended up freezing in that alley. Don't need to know. All I see is 2 kids who need food and a woman who needs a place to catch her breath. I got both. End of story." "It's not that simple." "Why not?" She opened her mouth to explain, about Thomas, about the debts, about the men who might come looking, about all the reasons she wasn't safe to be around. But Wyatt held up a hand. "Save it," he said. "You want to tell me, tell me. You don't, that's fine too. But don't sit there like you owe me your life story just because I gave you a bed and a meal. That ain't how this works." He grabbed his coat from a hook by the door. "Storm's clearing tonight," he said. "Tomorrow we'll see what needs fixing after the snow. You rest. Kids rest. We'll figure out the rest as we go." He left, the door closing behind him with a soft thud. Miriam sat at the table, stunned, while Ben and Lila stared at her with wide eyes. "Mama," Ben whispered, "can we really stay?" She didn't know, didn't trust it, didn't understand why a stranger would offer shelter with no strings attached. But for tonight, they had a roof, food, warmth. Tomorrow could wait. "Yes," she said, pulling her children close. "We can stay." And for the first time since Thomas died, Miriam Dale let herself believe that maybe, just maybe, they'd found a place where survival wasn't the only thing left to hope for. The winter came down hard after that first storm, like the land itself had decided to test them. Miriam woke before dawn every morning to the sound of Wyatt moving through the house, boots on wood, the creak of the door, the soft nicker of his horse greeting him in the cold. She'd lie there in the shed's narrow cot with Ben and Lila pressed against her sides, listening to the rhythm of his day beginning, and feel something strange and unfamiliar stir in her chest. Gratitude, maybe, or just the dizzy relief of waking up somewhere that didn't require immediate flight. By the time pale light crept through the shed's single window, she was up and dressed, her fingers working through the knots in Lila's hair, while Ben pulled on his coat and tried to look ready for whatever work Wyatt had in mind. The pattern established itself without discussion. Wyatt would appear at the shed door with coffee in a tin cup and a list of tasks delivered in his usual economical style. Chickens, water, firewood, mending if there's time. Then he'd disappear into the barn or the fields, and Miriam would marshal her small army of 2 and get to work. The ranch wasn't large, maybe 80 acres of grazing land, a vegetable garden buried under snow, the barn, the hen house, and the house itself. But it was enough to keep 3 people busy from sunup to sundown, especially with winter making every task twice as hard. Miriam learned the geography of Wyatt's life through his possessions. The mending pile told stories of long days and longer nights, shirts worn through at the elbows, socks darned so many times they were more patch than original fabric. The kitchen revealed a man who ate to survive rather than enjoy. Salt pork, dried beans, hardtack, coffee strong enough to strip paint. The bookshelf in the corner held exactly 3 volumes, a Bible so worn the binding had split, a farmer's almanac from 1883, and a collection of Robert Burns' poems that looked like it had never been opened. She didn't ask about the poems, didn't ask about the second chair at the table that Wyatt never sat in, or the locked door at the back of the house that he disappeared behind sometimes in the evenings. He'd given them space to breathe. She could give him the same. Ben took to ranch work like he'd been born to it. Every morning he'd trail after Wyatt, watching how the man moved through chores with patient efficiency, and then he'd replicate those movements with fierce concentration, hauling water from the well, mucking stalls, scattering feed for the chickens. His thin arms got stronger, his shoulders broader, and Miriam watched her boy transform from the frightened child who'd huddled behind a store into something steadier. Lila improved more slowly. The warmth and steady food helped, but the cough lingered, rattling through her chest at night when the cold pressed hardest against the walls. Miriam would hold her daughter close, feeling each labored breath, and fight the terror that whispered she was going to lose this child the same way she'd lost Thomas. On the 5th morning, she found Wyatt in the barn checking a pregnant mare's belly. He glanced up when she entered but didn't speak, just went back to running his hands along the horse's sides with practiced gentleness. "Lila's cough isn't getting better," Miriam said, hating how her voice shook. Wyatt straightened. "Chest cold or something worse?" "I don't know. I'm not a doctor." "Nearest doctor's in Helena, 3 days' ride in good weather." He looked toward the shed where Lila was still sleeping. "Storm coming tonight, another big one. Won't be going anywhere for a while." Miriam's hands clenched. "Then what do I do?" Wyatt was quiet for a moment, thinking. Then he moved to a shelf at the back of the barn and pulled down a small wooden box. Inside were various bottles and tins, neatly labeled in a woman's careful handwriting. "My mother kept remedies," he said, selecting a dark bottle. "Horehound syrup for coughs. Mullein tea for chest congestion." He handed them to Miriam. "Boil water, steep the mullein, give her the syrup twice a day. Keep her warm, and keep her breathing steam when you can." Miriam took the bottles, their weight solid and real in her palms. "Your mother was a healer?" She had to be. Out here you learn or you die. "Is she Miriam stopped herself, but Wyatt's expression had already shuddered. Gone. Long time now. He turned back to the mare. Try the remedies. If she's not better in 3 days, we'll figure something else out. It wasn't comfort exactly, but it was something solid to hold on to, and Miriam had learned to take what she could get. The remedies helped. Within 2 days, Lila's cough had eased from constant to occasional, and the child started eating with more enthusiasm. She still tired easily, spending most afternoons curled by the shed stove with the worn blanket wrapped around her shoulders, but the fear that had been crushing Miriam's chest loosened just enough to let her breathe. The second storm hit on a Tuesday night, rattling the shed's walls and howling through every gap in the wood. Miriam lay awake listening to the wind scream and wondering if the structure would hold. Beside her, Ben and Lila slept fitfully, and she kept one hand on each of them, ready to grab them if the roof gave way. It held. When morning came, the world was buried under 3 feet of fresh snow, and the temperature had dropped so low that water froze solid in the bucket within minutes of being drawn from the well. Wyatt appeared at the shed door looking grim. Can't get to the barn. Snow's too deep. Gonna need help digging out. Miriam bundled Lila in every piece of fabric she could find and stationed her by the stove with strict orders to stay put. Then she and Ben followed Wyatt out into a landscape that had been transformed into something alien and hostile. The snow was chest-high in places, and every step required forcing their way through drifts that tried to swallow them whole. Wyatt moved ahead with a shovel, carving a path toward the barn, while Miriam and Ben worked behind him, widening the trail and trying not to think about how exposed they were out here. It took 3 hours to reach the barn. By the time they got the doors open, Miriam's hands were numb inside her gloves, and Ben's face was red and chapped from wind. Inside, the animals were restless but alive. The mare, 2 milk cows, and Wyatt's bay horse all huddled together for warmth. Wyatt worked quickly, forking hay and checking each animal for signs of frostbite or stress. Miriam helped where she could, and Ben hauled water that had to be broken free of ice first. Storm like this, you can lose everything in a night, Wyatt said, more to himself than to them. Animals freeze, roof caves in, pipes burst. He looked at the barn's roof, checking for strain. But this one held. That's something. They worked until the animals were fed and watered, then made the exhausting journey back to the house. Wyatt built up the fire until the main room was almost too warm, then heated water for coffee and stood at the window, watching the snow fall with an expression Miriam couldn't read. How long will this one last? She asked. Could be days. Could be a week. He took a long drink of coffee. You got enough supplies in the shed? For now. I'll bring more after dark. Can't have you freezing while you're under my roof. There it was again. That matter-of-fact protectiveness that wasn't quite kindness, but felt like something close to it. Ben stood near the stove, trying to warm his hands, and Wyatt glanced at him. You did good work out there, boy. Man's work. Ben's face lit up like someone had handed him the sun. Really? Don't say things I don't mean. Wyatt set down his cup. You keep working like that. We'll make a ranch hand out of you yet. Miriam watched her son stand a little straighter, shoulders squared, and felt something crack open in her chest. When was the last time someone had told Ben he was doing well? When was the last time anyone had seen him as more than just another mouth to feed? That night, after they'd returned to the shed and Lila was asleep, Ben whispered to Miriam in the darkness, Mama, do you think Mr. Wyatt likes us? Miriam considered the question carefully. I think Mr. Wyatt is a good man who's been alone a long time. But he let us stay. He did. Do you think we can stay forever? Forever. The word hung in the cold air between them, too big and too fragile to touch. I don't know, sweetheart. We'll stay as long as he lets us, and we'll be grateful for every day. Ben was quiet for a moment, then, I like it here, Mama. I like working. I like feeling useful. Miriam pulled him closer, pressing her face against his hair. I know, baby, I know. The storm lasted 5 days. On the 3rd day, Wyatt came to the shed at midday with a pot of stew and stayed while they ate, sitting on an overturned crate and watching the snow fall through the window. He didn't talk much, but his presence filled the small space in a way that wasn't uncomfortable. Lila, feeling better, asked him questions in her piping voice. Do you have any children, Mr. Wyatt? No. Do you have a wife? Miriam started to hush her, but Wyatt held up a hand. Had a brother, he said quietly. Died 6 years back. Worked this ranch together since we were boys. What happened to him? Lila asked with a child's blunt curiosity. Horse threw him, broke his neck. Wyatt's voice was flat, emotionless. Was dead before I could get to him. The silence that followed was heavy. Miriam didn't know what to say. Sorry felt insufficient, and any other words felt like intrusion. But Lila, bless her innocent heart, just nodded solemnly. My papa died too. Mama says he's in heaven now. Wyatt looked at the little girl for a long moment. I'm sure he is. Later, after Wyatt had left and the children were occupied with a game involving pebbles and a tin cup, Miriam found herself thinking about that brother, about a house built for two men that now held only one, about loneliness so deep it became its own kind of weather. She understood that better than she wanted to admit. On the fourth day of the storm, Miriam found Wyatt in the barn mending harness leather by lantern light. The wind still howled outside, but the snow had finally stopped falling. Thought you might want this, she said, holding out a shirt she'd mended. The elbows had been worn through, but she'd patched them with fabric from an old flour sack, and her stitches were small and neat. Wyatt took it, examining her work in the lamplight. Good stitching. My mother taught me, said a woman who could sew could always make herself useful. Your mother's still alive? No. Fever took her when I was 16. Wyatt nodded, setting the shirt aside. What about your husband? Miriam tensed. She'd known this question would come eventually, but that didn't make it easier to answer. Thomas died 3 months ago, she said carefully. Same fever that's been going around Kansas. Took him in 4 days. And you ended up walking to Montana Territory because men came to collect debts I didn't know Thomas had. Bank loans, gambling debts. They burned our wagon when I couldn't pay. Her voice hardened. Said I could work off what we owed, but the way they looked at me when they said it made it clear what kind of work they meant. Wyatt's hands stilled on the leather. So you ran. So I took my children, and I walked. 300 miles, give or take. Thought maybe I could find work somewhere nobody knew us. Start over. She laughed bitterly. Didn't account for winter coming early, or how many doors get shut when you're a woman with no husband and no money. Most people out here don't trust strangers, Wyatt said. Too many drifters and con men. Too many folks running from something they won't talk about. Are you running from something? He looked at her then, really looked, and Miriam saw something flicker behind his eyes. Pain, maybe, or just exhaustion. No, he said finally. I'm just here because leaving would mean giving up the only thing I got left. They sat in silence for a moment, the lantern casting dancing shadows on the barn walls. Those men who burned your wagon, Wyatt said. They know where you went? I don't think so. We kept to back roads, avoided towns when we could. She hesitated. You worried they'll come looking? Just want to know what I'm dealing with. Miriam felt ice slide down her spine. Mr. Wyatt, if you're worried we'll bring trouble, we can leave. When the snow clears, we'll... Didn't say you had to leave. His voice was calm, matter-of-fact. Just said I want to know. Man's got a right to understand what might be riding up his road someday. I don't want to put you in danger. Lady, I've been in danger since the day I was born. This is Montana Territory, not some fancy city back east. Danger's just part of the landscape. He went back to his mending. Those men come here, I'll deal with it. But I need to know they might. Miriam nodded slowly. They might. Good. Now I know. He said it like it was settled, like the possibility of violent men showing up to claim her was just another item on a list of ranch chores. Miriam didn't know whether to be reassured or terrified. By the 5th day, the storm had blown itself out and the world emerged scraped clean and glittering. The sun came out for the first time in weeks, turning the snow into a field of diamonds that hurt to look at. Wyatt declared it a day for assessment rather than heavy work. He walked the property line checking fences while Miriam and Ben cleared paths and Lila sat bundled on the porch, watching them with pink cheeks and bright eyes. That evening, Wyatt invited them to eat in the house again. He'd made venison stew with root vegetables from his cellar, and the smell was so good it made Miriam's mouth water. They ate in silence for a while, The only sounds the scrape of spoons on plates and the crack of the fire. Then Lila, emboldened by her recovery and the warmth, spoke up. "Mr. Wyatt, why do you live all alone?" Ben kicked her under the table, but Wyatt just raised an eyebrow. "Because I do." "But don't you get lonely?" "Lila," Miriam said warningly, but Wyatt was studying the little girl with something like amusement. "Sometimes, but lonely's better than some alternatives." "Like what?" "Like having folks around who make you wish you were alone." Lila thought about this seriously. "We won't make you wish that. We're very good at being quiet when we need to be." "That's so?" "Yes, sir. Mama says knowing when to be quiet is a valuable skill." Wyatt's mouth twitched, not quite a smile, but close. "Your mama's a smart woman." After dinner, while Miriam washed dishes and the children sat by the fire, Wyatt pulled out a worn deck of cards and taught Ben a simple game. Miriam watched them from the corner of her eye, saw the careful way Wyatt explained the rules, the patience he showed when Ben made mistakes. This was what her son had been missing. Not a father exactly, but a man who treated him like he mattered, like he was worth teaching. When they finally returned to the shed that night, full and warm and content, Miriam lay in the darkness and let herself imagine something dangerous. What if they could stay? What if this wasn't just temporary shelter, but the beginning of something permanent? What if Wyatt Carver's lonely ranch could become a home, not just for him, but for all of them? The thought was terrifying and thrilling in equal measure. She pushed it away and tried to sleep, but it lingered at the edges of her mind like morning light before dawn, impossible to ignore, impossible to trust, but undeniably there. The next morning brought a visitor. Miriam was in the henhouse collecting eggs when she heard hoofbeats. Her first instinct was fear, the men from Kansas, finding her somehow. But when she peered through the crack in the door, she saw a lone rider approaching, older, wearing a star on his coat. A lawman. Her blood turned to ice. She set down the egg basket with shaking hands and forced herself to walk toward the house. Wyatt was already on the porch, waiting, his posture relaxed but his eyes alert. The sheriff, because that's what the star meant, dismounted slowly, his gaze sweeping over the property and landing on Miriam with uncomfortable intensity. "Wyatt," he said by way of greeting. "Sheriff Morrison." Wyatt's voice gave nothing away. "Long ride out here, must be important." "Got word there's a woman with 2 children staying on your property." Morrison looked at Miriam directly now. "That you, ma'am?" Miriam's throat closed. She managed a nod. "Name?" "Miriam Dale." Morrison pulled a piece of paper from his coat. "Got a wire from Kansas last week. Sheriff, there's looking for a woman named Miriam Dale who left under questionable circumstances. Says there's outstanding debts and some folks want to talk to her about them." The world tilted. Miriam grabbed the porch railing to steady herself. "What kind of debts?" Wyatt asked, his voice dangerously quiet. "Doesn't say exactly. Just says she's wanted for questioning." Morrison looked at Miriam. "You running from the law, Mrs. Dale?" "No." Her voice came out stronger than she felt. "I'm running from men who wanted to force me into prostitution to pay off my dead husband's gambling debts. Men who burned everything I owned and threatened my children. If that's against the law, then yes, I'm guilty." Morrison's expression didn't change. "That's your story?" "That's the truth." "Truth and story ain't always the same thing." He folded the paper and tucked it back in his coat. "But I've been doing this job 20 years, and I know the difference between a criminal and someone running scared." He looked at Wyatt. "She causing you problems?" "No." "You vouching for her?" Wyatt stepped down from the porch, positioning himself subtly between Miriam and the sheriff. "She's working for room and board. Hasn't stolen anything. Hasn't caused trouble. Hasn't done anything except try to keep herself and her kids alive through winter. That good enough for you?" Morrison studied Wyatt for a long moment. Then he mounted his horse. "I'll write back to Kansas and tell them I found nothing worth pursuing. But Mrs. Dale, if you're lying to me—" "I'm not." "Then you've got nothing to worry about." He tipped his hat. "Wyatt, keep your nose clean. And ma'am, next time you run from something, try running somewhere warmer." He rode off, and Miriam stood frozen on the porch, unable to believe what had just happened. Wyatt turned to look at her, his expression unreadable. You didn't tell me it was that bad. Would it have changed anything? No. He climbed back onto the porch. But now I know what we're dealing with. We? He looked at her then, and Miriam saw something shift in his eyes. You're under my roof. That makes it my problem, too. Before she could respond, he walked into the house, leaving her standing in the cold with her heart hammering and something that felt dangerously like hope blooming in her chest. That night, after the children were asleep, Miriam lay in the darkness and let herself cry, not from fear or sadness, but from the overwhelming relief of having someone stand between her and danger for the first time since Thomas died. She cried until her pillow was damp and her chest ached. And when morning came, she got up and went back to work, because that's what survivors did. They kept going. The days that followed fell into a rhythm that felt almost like normalcy. Miriam worked until her hands ached, grateful for the distraction and the purpose. Ben shadowed Wyatt everywhere, soaking up knowledge like a dry sponge. Lila improved daily, her cough fading to nothing, her cheeks filling out from steady meals. And Wyatt remained what he'd always been, steady, quiet, present without demanding presence. But something had shifted after the sheriff's visit. Miriam noticed it in small ways, how Wyatt checked the road more often, how his rifle stayed closer to hand, how his eyes tracked the horizon like he was waiting for something. One evening, as they sat in the main house after dinner, Miriam finally asked what had been weighing on her mind. Do you regret letting us stay? Wyatt looked up from the harness he was mending. Why would I? Because we brought trouble to your door, because Morrison's visit wasn't trouble. It was information. He set down his work. Now I know what might be coming, and I can prepare. That's better than being surprised. But if those men come, I'll handle it. How? His gaze was steady, unflinching. However I need to. The certainty in his voice should have frightened her. Instead, it made her feel safer than she'd felt in months. As winter deepened and the snow piled higher, Miriam found herself watching Wyatt when he wasn't looking, noticing the way his hands moved with unconscious grace through familiar tasks, the way he spoke to his animals with quiet respect, the way he never touched her or her children without clear purpose, never invaded their space, never made them feel like they owed him anything beyond honest work. She caught herself wondering what it would be like to stay here not as charity or hired help, but as something more permanent, something that had nothing to do with debt or obligation and everything to do with choice. The thought terrified her. She'd chosen wrong once before, hadn't she? Chosen Thomas and ended up widowed, destitute, running for her life. What made her think she could trust her judgment now? But then she'd watch Wyatt teach Ben how to mend a fence properly, or see him slip Lila an extra biscuit when he thought no one was looking, and she'd think, maybe this time is different. Maybe this man is different. Or maybe she was just desperate and tired and confusing kindness with something deeper. She didn't know. All she knew was that for the first time since Thomas died, she could imagine a future that wasn't just about surviving day to day. She could imagine waking up in this place a year from now, 2 years, 10. Could imagine Ben growing into a man on this land, Lila learning to ride horses and collect eggs, and be fearless in the way only children who've been given safety can be. Could imagine herself standing beside Wyatt Carver not as a refugee or a burden, but as a partner in the hard, honest work of building a life worth living. It was a dangerous thing to imagine. But as February gave way to the first hints of March, as the snow finally began to melt, and the air carried the promise of spring, Miriam let herself imagine it anyway. And she wondered if maybe, just maybe, Wyatt was imagining it too. The thaw came slowly, reluctantly, like the land itself wasn't sure it wanted to let go of winter. Miriam noticed it first in the way the icicles hanging from the barn roof began to drip at midday, their steady rhythm marking time like a clock. Then came the soft spots in the snow where sunlight managed to penetrate, creating pockets of mud that sucked at boots and made every step treacherous. The creek behind the property, silent and frozen since December, began to murmur again, a tentative sound that grew louder each day. With the thaw came new work. Fences that had stood buried under snow revealed damage from the weight, posts leaning, rails split, wire sagging. The roof of the hen house had developed a leak that needed patching before the spring rains began in earnest. And the vegetable garden, invisible for months, emerged as a rectangle of frost-heaved earth that would need turning before anything could be planted. Wyatt surveyed it all with the grim assessment of a man who'd done this dance too many times to find it romantic. "Gonna be a long spring," he said one morning, standing in the yard with his hands on his hips. "Ranch damn near falls apart every winter. Spend half the year putting it back together." Miriam stood beside him, watching Ben attempt to hammer a loose board back onto the henhouse wall. "You do this alone every year?" "Since my brother died, yeah. That's a lot for one person," Wyatt shrugged. "It's what needs doing." But Miriam heard what he didn't say, that it was exhausting, that some years he wasn't sure he'd make it, that loneliness made every task twice as hard because there was no one to share the burden or the small victories when something actually got fixed properly. "Well," she said quietly, "you're not alone this year." Wyatt looked at her then, something unreadable flickering across his face. "No, I guess I'm not." They worked side by side that day, rebuilding fence sections while Ben hauled new posts and Lila, still not strong enough for heavy labor, kept them supplied with water and the occasional encouraging comment. The work was hard and muddy and left them all exhausted by sunset, but there was satisfaction in seeing the fence stand straight again, in knowing they'd accomplished something solid. That night, Wyatt made venison stew again, his default meal, Miriam had learned, and they ate in the warm kitchen while the wind rattled the windows. Lila had fallen asleep at the table, her head pillowed on her arms, and Ben wasn't far behind, his eyes drooping despite his attempts to stay alert. "Better get them to bed," Wyatt said, nodding toward the children. Miriam started to gather Lila into her arms, but Wyatt stood. "I got her." He lifted the little girl with surprising gentleness, cradling her against his chest like she weighed nothing. Lila stirred but didn't wake, and Miriam felt her throat tighten at the sight. This hard, solitary man carrying her daughter like she was something precious. They walked to the shed in silence, Ben stumbling along beside them, and Wyatt laid Lila on the cot carefully before stepping back. "Sleep well," he said, and left before Miriam could thank him. She tucked both children under the blankets and stood there in the darkness, listening to their soft breathing and wondering how much longer this fragile arrangement could last. The roads would be clear soon. Spring would bring travelers, merchants, maybe even the men from Kansas, if they were determined enough. And then what? Would Wyatt still want them here when the danger of their presence became real rather than theoretical? She didn't let herself answer that question. Not yet. The answer came riding up the road 3 days later, except it wasn't the answer she'd been dreading. Miriam was hanging laundry on a line Wyatt had strung between two posts, sheets and shirts snapping in the wind like flags, when she heard the wagon. Her hands froze on a clothespin, every muscle tensing, but when she looked up, she saw not the hard men from her nightmares, but a weathered farm wagon pulled by two tired-looking mules. 2 men sat on the bench, both rough-dressed and unshaven, and even from a distance, Miriam could see the hungry way their eyes tracked across the property, taking inventory, calculating. Wyatt emerged from the barn, rifle in hand but held casually. Not pointing, not threatening, just present. The wagon stopped 20 feet from the house. "Help you, gentlemen?" Wyatt's voice was level, conversational even, but Miriam heard the steel underneath. The driver, older, with a scar running through one eyebrow, smiled without warmth. "Heard you got a woman and some kids staying here. Woman named Dale?" Miriam's heart stopped. "Might," Wyatt said. "Who's asking?" "Name's Tucker. This here's my associate, Mr. Boone." Tucker gestured to the younger man beside him, who was staring at Miriam with an intensity that made her skin crawl. "We've come a long way from Kansas looking for Mrs. Dale. Got some business to settle with her." "What kind of business?" "The kind that's between us and her." Tucker's smile widened. "Now why don't you be a good neighbor and let us talk to the lady?" "Won't take but a minute." Wyatt shifted his weight slightly, and the rifle, still not aimed, still not threatening, somehow became more present. "Any business you got with someone on my property goes through me first." "That's so?" Tucker's eyes narrowed. "You her husband?" "No." Her brother? Cousin? You got some legal claim to her? I got the claim of her standing on my land under my protection. That's all the claim I need. Boone spoke for the first time, his voice higher and reedy. Protection? From what? We just want to talk. Then talk, Wyatt said. From right where you're sitting. Tucker's expression darkened. Listen, friend, we rode 300 miles. Not my problem. To collect on a debt that woman's late husband left unpaid. Now I'm trying to be civilized about this, but my patience has limits. So does mine. Wyatt's voice dropped to something dangerous. And you're about to find them. The two men exchanged glances. Miriam saw Boone's hand drift toward his coat, and her breath caught. But Tucker held up a hand, stopping him. Easy now, Tucker said, his smile returning but colder now. No need for anyone to do something stupid. He looked at Miriam, who'd frozen by the clothesline. Mrs. Dale, your husband owed money to some important people back in Kansas. Good people who were kind enough to extend him credit when he needed it. Now Thomas is dead, God rest his soul, but that debt doesn't die with him. I don't have any money, Miriam said, forcing the words past her tight throat. Thomas never told me about those debts. I can't pay what I don't have. Well now, that's where you're wrong. Tucker's eyes traveled over her in a way that made Miriam want to scrub her skin. See, there's more than one way to work off a debt. Woman, with your looks, you could clear that balance in a few months, maybe less, if you're good at what you do. The meaning was clear, and Miriam felt bile rise in her throat. Wyatt took 2 steps forward, and suddenly the rifle wasn't casual anymore. It was aimed directly at Tucker's chest, steady as stone. Get off my land. Tucker's smile vanished. Now hold on. You heard me. Turn that wagon around and ride back to whatever hole you crawled out of. That woman owes... She don't owe you a goddamn thing. Wyatt's voice was quiet now, deadly quiet. Her husband's debts died with him, and if the men you work for think different, they can take it up with the territorial judge. But they're not taking it up with her. Boone's hand was definitely inside his coat now, and Miriam saw Wyatt notice. His finger moved to the trigger. Pull that gun and you'll be dead before it clears leather, Wyatt said calmly. Your friend, too. I got 2 more rifles in the barn and enough ammunition to keep you from ever leaving this property. Your choice. The silence stretched thin and dangerous. Miriam couldn't breathe, couldn't move, could only watch as Tucker and Boone weighed their options against the steady certainty in Wyatt's eyes. Finally, Tucker spat into the mud. This ain't over. Yes, it is. Wyatt took another step forward. You come back here, I'll bury you both in that creek bed and no one will ever know what happened to you. That's a promise, not a threat. Tucker yanked the reins, turning the mules. Boone kept his hand in his coat but didn't draw, and Miriam saw murder in his eyes as he stared at Wyatt. She ain't yours, Tucker called as the wagon lurched into motion. You got no legal right to keep her. I got the right of this rifle and this land, Wyatt shot back. That's more right than you'll ever have. The wagon rolled away, wheels churning through mud, and Wyatt stood watching until it disappeared around the bend in the road. Only then did he lower the rifle, and Miriam saw his hands were shaking slightly. She ran to him without thinking, her legs barely holding her. Wyatt, get inside. His voice was rough. Both of you. Miriam realized Ben had emerged from the barn at some point, his face white with fear. She grabbed her son's hand and pulled him toward the house, her heart hammering so hard she thought it might break through her ribs. Inside, Wyatt set the rifle against the wall and stood with his back to them, breathing hard. His shoulders were rigid with tension, and when he finally turned around, his expression was harder than Miriam had ever seen it. They'll be back, he said. Maybe not today, maybe not tomorrow, but they'll be back. Men like that don't give up easy. Miriam sank into a chair, pulling Ben against her side. I'm sorry. God, Wyatt, I'm so sorry. I should have told you exactly how bad it was. I should have... Stop. He held up a hand. You told me enough. I knew what I was getting into. But now they know where I am. They'll tell others. They might come back with more men with... Let them come. Wyatt moved to the window, looking out at the empty road. This is my land. I decide who stays and who goes. And I decided you stay. Why? The word came out broken. Why would you risk this for us? We're nothing to you. We're just... You're not nothing. He turned to look at her, and Miriam saw something raw in his eyes. You work hard, you don't complain, you take care of your kids, and you helped put this ranch back together after winter. That's not nothing. That's more than most people ever give. But those men are cowards who make their living hurting people weaker than them. I've dealt with their kind before. His jaw tightened. My brother died because of men like that. Ran up debts gambling, and when they came to collect, he tried to run. Horse threw him in the dark while he was trying to get away. Miriam's breath caught. Wyatt. I found him the next morning, neck broken, eyes still open. His voice was flat, emotionless in the way of someone who told this story too many times in his own head. Took me 6 months to pay off what he owed. Damn near lost the ranch doing it. So yeah, I know exactly what kind of men we're dealing with, and I'll be damned if I let them take someone else from this land. The silence that followed was heavy with shared pain. Miriam wanted to say something, anything, but words felt inadequate against the weight of what he'd just revealed. Ben spoke up instead, his voice small but determined. I can help. I can stand watch, or... No. Wyatt's voice softened slightly. Your job is to take care of your mama and sister. Let me worry about the rest. But, Ben... Miriam pulled her son closer. Listen to him. Wyatt crossed to where they sat and crouched down to Ben's level, his expression serious. You're a brave kid, but being brave doesn't mean putting yourself in danger when you don't have to. Right now, the best thing you can do is stay alert, stay close to the house, and if anything feels wrong, anything at all, you come get me. Understand? Ben nodded reluctantly. Good man. Wyatt stood and looked at Miriam. I'm going to ride out and talk to Morrison. Let him know what happened. If Tucker and his friend are smart, they'll leave the territory before the sheriff starts asking questions about threatening behavior. And if they're not smart? Wyatt's expression was grim. Then we'll deal with it when the time comes. He left, and Miriam sat in the sudden silence, feeling the weight of everything that had just happened crash down on her. She'd brought danger to this place, to this man who'd shown her nothing but rough kindness, to this small piece of land that had started to feel like something she couldn't quite name but desperately wanted. Ben pressed against her side, and she wrapped her arms around him, holding tight. Mama, he whispered, are we going to have to leave? The question stabbed through her. I don't know, baby. I don't want to leave. I like it here. I like Mr. Wyatt. I know. Do you think he likes us? Miriam thought about the way Wyatt had stood between her and Tucker, rifle steady, voice certain. Thought about the way he'd carried Lila to bed, taught Ben to mend fences, given them space to heal without demanding anything in return. Yeah, she said softly. I think he does. Wyatt returned 3 hours later, his expression tight. He dismounted and led his horse to the barn, and Miriam met him at the door. What did Morrison say? Said he'd ask around, see if anyone knows Tucker and Boone, maybe pay them a visit if they're still in the territory. Wyatt unsaddled his horse with methodical movements. But Morrison's got a lot of ground to cover and not much authority outside town limits. We're pretty much on our own out here. I'm sorry. Stop apologizing. He carried the saddle to its rack. You didn't bring this trouble. They did. And I meant what I said. This is my land, and I decide who stays. But even if it means putting yourself in danger? Wyatt turned to look at her, and in the dim light of the barn, his eyes were steady. Miriam, I've been in danger my whole life. That's what living out here means, but at least now I'm in danger for something worth protecting. The words hung between them, heavy with meaning Miriam didn't dare examine too closely. Thank you, she said quietly, for standing up for us, for not just turning us over to them. Is that what you expected? I didn't know what to expect. Most men would have chosen the easier path. I'm not most men. He moved past her toward the barn door. Get some rest. I'm going to keep watch tonight. You can't stay awake all night. Watch me. Wyatt! He stopped and looked back at her. Those men know where you are now. That means they might come back after dark when they think we're sleeping. I'm not taking that chance. His voice softened just slightly. So go back to the shed, lock the door, and try to sleep. I'll be right here. Miriam wanted to argue, wanted to insist that he couldn't protect them indefinitely, that this was asking too much. But she saw the set of his jaw and knew arguing would be pointless. "All right," she said, "but tomorrow night I take a shift. You need rest too." "We'll see." "Wyatt, we'll see, Miriam." She left him in the barn, his rifle across his knees and his eyes on the road, and carried that image back to the shed where her children waited. She told them Wyatt was keeping watch, that they were safe, that everything would be fine. She didn't know if she believed it herself. That night, Miriam lay awake listening to the darkness, every sound magnified into potential threat. The wind in the trees became footsteps. The creak of wood became doors opening. The distant cry of a coyote became men's voices calling to each other in the dark. But dawn came, and nothing had happened. Wyatt was still in his barn when she emerged, looking exhausted but alert. She brought him coffee without being asked, and he took it with a nod of gratitude. "They didn't come," Miriam said. "Not yet." He drank deeply. "But they will. Question is when." The days that followed were tense and strange. They continued their work, fences, garden, animals, but now there was an edge to everything. Wyatt kept his rifle close, and Miriam found herself looking toward the road constantly, jumping at every unexpected sound. Ben picked up on the tension and became quieter, more watchful. He stopped asking questions and started positioning himself between his mother and any potential danger, standing at windows, checking corners, trying so hard to be the protector he wasn't old enough to be. Lila, bless her innocent heart, seemed oblivious to the danger. She chattered away while collecting eggs, sang to herself while washing dishes, and asked Wyatt earnest questions about why horses had such long faces and whether chickens dreamed at night. Her innocence was both a gift and a burden. Miriam was grateful one of her children could still be carefree, but it also reminded her of everything they stood to lose if Tucker and Boone came back. On the fourth day after the confrontation, Sheriff Morrison rode up again. Miriam's heart sank when she saw him. Surely he wasn't here to tell them they had to leave, that Wyatt couldn't harbor a fugitive or whatever legal excuse Tucker might have manufactured. But Morrison's expression was neutral as he dismounted. "Wyatt, Mrs. Dale." "Sheriff," Wyatt said carefully. "News?" "Some." Morrison pulled out a small notebook. "Asked around about Tucker and Boone. Found out they're working for a man named Silas Garrett. Runs a saloon and gambling hall in Kansas City. Garrett's got a reputation for using intimidation to collect on debts, but he's careful to stay just on the right side of the law." "So he sends men like Tucker to do his dirty work," Miriam said bitterly. "Exactly." Morrison tucked away his notebook. "But here's the thing. I talked to the territorial judge about your situation, told him about your husband's death, about these men showing up to collect. Judge says that without a legal judgment against you specifically, they got no right to force you into anything. The debt died with your husband, far as the law is concerned." Hope flared in Miriam's chest. "So they can't legally compel you to pay or work off the debt. Doesn't mean they won't try. Men like that don't care much about what's legal." Morrison looked at Wyatt. "You sure you want to keep her here? Might be safer for everyone if she moved into town where there's more people around." "No," Wyatt's voice was firm. "She stays here." Morrison studied him for a long moment. "Your ranch, your choice. But keep that rifle handy. And if Tucker and Boone show up again, send for me immediately. I can't stop them from being in the territory, but I can arrest them if they threaten violence." After Morrison left, Miriam felt simultaneously relieved and more terrified than before. The law was on her side, but the law was also far away and understaffed and couldn't protect her every moment. Wyatt seemed to be thinking the same thing. "We need a better plan than just waiting for them to show up." "What kind of plan?" He looked at the house, the barn, the land stretching around them. "We fortify, make it clear that coming here will be more trouble than they're willing to deal with, and we prepare for the possibility that they're stubborn enough to try anyway." Over the next week, Wyatt transformed the ranch into something defensible. He reinforced the barn doors, added shutters to windows that could be barred from inside, and cleared sight lines around the house so no one could approach unseen. He taught Miriam how to load and fire his spare rifle, making her practice until her shoulder ached from the recoil, but her aim was steady. Ben begged to be included in the shooting lessons, but Wyatt refused. "You're not ready for that responsibility yet. Maybe in a few years. But I want to help protect Mama and Lila. Wyatt knelt down to the boy's level. You know the best way to protect them. By being smart, not brave. By knowing when to hide and when to run. By understanding that sometimes the strongest thing you can do is survive. He put a hand on Ben's shoulder. Can you do that for me? Ben nodded reluctantly, and Miriam saw her son struggle with the desire to be a man and the reality of still being a child. It broke her heart. As March deepened and the land turned from white to brown, to the first hints of green, Miriam found herself caught between gratitude and guilt. Gratitude for this place, this man, this unexpected sanctuary. Guilt for the danger her presence had brought, for the disruption to Wyatt's solitary life, for the fear that had replaced whatever fragile peace he'd found here. One evening, after the children were asleep and she'd returned to the house for a cup of coffee, she found Wyatt sitting at the table cleaning his rifle. The lamplight cast shadows across his face, making him look older and more tired than usual. I've been thinking, she said carefully, about what happens when the roads are fully clear, about whether staying here is fair to you. Wyatt didn't look up from his work. What's fair got to do with anything? Everything. You didn't sign up for this, for me, for my problems, for men showing up with threats. You just wanted to help, and Miriam. He finally looked at her. If I didn't want you here, you wouldn't be here. It's that simple. But no buts. You work hard, you don't cause trouble, and your kids are good kids. That's all that matters to me. He went back to cleaning the rifle. Rest of it, the danger, the threats, all of that. That's just part of life out here. Always has been. It doesn't have to be your life, though. You could ask us to leave. You could what? Send you and those kids back out on the road with nowhere to go and men hunting you? His voice was sharp now. That what you think I should do? No, I don't want you to feel trapped by your own kindness. Wyatt set down the rifle and looked at her steadily. I don't feel trapped. I feel like for the first time in 6 years, this place actually feels like a home. Instead of just a piece of land, I'm too stubborn to leave. He stood and moved to the stove, pouring coffee with his back to her. You and those kids, you brought life back here. Real life, not just existing. And yeah, maybe that came with complications, but I'll take complications over empty silence any day. Miriam's throat tightened. Wyatt! So stop apologizing. Stop trying to convince me to send you away. And start accepting that maybe, just maybe, I want you here. He turned to look at her. Can you do that? She nodded, not trusting her voice. They stood in silence for a moment, the weight of unspoken things hanging between them. Then Wyatt cleared his throat and moved toward the door. Get some rest. I'll keep watch tonight. Let me take a shift. You need to sleep too. He paused, considering. All right. You take midnight to 3, then wake me. But you see anything at all, you come get me immediately. I will. He left, and Miriam stood alone in the kitchen, her heart pounding with something that wasn't quite fear and wasn't quite hope, but lived somewhere in between. She was still standing there when the midnight bells didn't ring, because there were no bells out here, just the vast Montana darkness and the sound of her own breathing. But she knew it was time for her watch. She took the rifle Wyatt had taught her to use and positioned herself by the barn door, her eyes slowly adjusting to the darkness. The stars were bright overhead, the moon just past full, and in the silvery light she could see the road, the fences, the gentle rise and fall of land that Wyatt Carver had chosen to defend. And she understood, finally, that he wasn't just defending the land. He was defending the idea that people deserved second chances, that running from something didn't mean you had to run forever, that a home could be built on more than just legal claims and blood ties. It could be built on choice, on standing your ground, on deciding that this place, these people, this moment, they were worth fighting for. Miriam held the rifle steady and watched the road, and she waited. 3 hours passed without incident, and Miriam's eyes had started to burn from staring into darkness when she heard the sound. Not hoofbeats or wagon wheels, just the soft scrape of boot on gravel, so quiet she almost convinced herself she'd imagined it. She went rigid, every muscle tensing, the rifle suddenly heavy in her hands. She'd promised Wyatt she'd get him at the first sign of trouble, but what if going for him meant taking her eyes off whatever was out there? What if the sound was nothing? An animal, the wind, her exhausted mind playing tricks. The scrape came again, closer this time, and Miriam's heart hammered against her ribs. She rose slowly, careful not to make noise, and moved deeper into the barn's shadow. From there she could see the yard, the house, the road beyond, all painted silver by moonlight and empty of movement. Then a shape detached itself from the trees near the property line. A man, moving low and cautious, his face obscured by shadow. Miriam's breath stopped. She raised the rifle like Wyatt had taught her, sighting down the barrel, her finger finding the trigger. But her hands were shaking, and she couldn't remember if she was supposed to call out first or just shoot, couldn't think past the roaring panic in her ears. The man took another step forward, and moonlight caught his face. Boone. The reedy-voiced one who'd stared at her with such hungry intensity. And if Boone was here, Tucker couldn't be far behind. Miriam backed toward the barn door, keeping the rifle trained on Boone's advancing shape. She needed to get to Wyatt, needed to wake him, but terror had turned her legs to water and she couldn't seem to move. Boone stopped at the edge of the yard, his head turning as he scanned the property, looking for weaknesses, planning his approach. Miriam's finger tightened on the trigger, and in that moment she understood with perfect clarity that she could kill this man. Would kill him if he took another step toward the house where her children slept. But before she could make that choice, another voice cut through the darkness. "That's far enough." Wyatt emerged from the shadow of the house, his rifle already aimed, his voice carrying across the yard with quiet authority. Boone froze. "Thought you boys had more sense than to come back here," Wyatt continued, not moving, not lowering his weapon. "Guess I was wrong. Just came to talk." Boone's voice was higher than Miriam remembered, pitched with nervous energy. "No need for anyone to get excited. Talk from there then. You take another step and I start shooting. Mr. Tucker wants to make a deal, says he'll forgive Mrs. Dale's debt entirely if she just comes back to Kansas for a conversation. Just a conversation, that's all. No harm, no trouble." "No. You didn't even let me finish. Don't need to. Answer's no." Wyatt's voice hardened. "Now where's Tucker?" "I came alone." "Try again." Silence. Then Tucker's voice called from somewhere beyond the tree line, too distant to pinpoint exactly. "No need for hostilities, Carver. We're reasonable men. Reasonable men don't sneak around in the dark." Wyatt shifted his aim toward the trees. "Show yourself or get off my land." "Can't do that. Your woman put a bullet in a man's head once before when he tried to collect peacefully. We're just being cautious." Miriam's blood ran cold. That was a lie. She'd never shot anyone, had barely even held a gun before Wyatt taught her. But Tucker was crafting a story, building a case for why they needed to take her by force, making her sound dangerous so their violence would seem justified. "She's never shot anyone," Wyatt called back. "But I have, and I'll do it again if you don't leave. Last warning." A beat of silence. Then Tucker's laugh drifted through the darkness, cold and mocking. "You're one man, Carver. You can't watch everywhere at once. Eventually you'll slip, and when you do, we'll be there." "Looking forward to it," Wyatt said calmly. "I could use target practice." Another pause, longer this time. Then the sound of movement in the trees, boots retreating, branches rustling, the faint creak of leather that meant men mounting horses. Boone backed away slowly, his eyes never leaving Wyatt's rifle, until he too disappeared into the tree line. The hoofbeats that followed were slow, deliberate, heading away from the ranch but not toward town. Just away, into the vast darkness of the territory. Wyatt stood motionless for 5 full minutes after the sounds faded, his rifle still raised, before he finally lowered it and turned toward the barn. "You can come out now." Miriam emerged on shaking legs, the rifle clutched against her chest. "I'm sorry. I should have come to get you sooner. You did fine." Wyatt took the rifle from her hands before she could drop it. "You stayed quiet, stayed hidden, and kept your weapon ready. That's exactly what you were supposed to do." "But I was terrified. I couldn't think straight, Fear keeps you alive out here. It's not weakness." He checked the rifle's load, then handed it back to her. "How long were they here before I showed?" "Maybe 2 minutes. Boone came from the trees, but Tucker stayed back." "Smart." Wyatt looked toward the property line, his jaw tight. "They were testing us. Seeing how alert we are, how fast we respond. Probably watching the house too, seeing where everyone sleeps. The thought made Miriam's stomach turn. What do we do? We don't sleep easy until this is settled. He started toward the house. Come on, we need to wake Ben and get everyone in the main house. Shed's too exposed. Miriam followed him, her mind spinning. You think they'll come back tonight? Maybe. Maybe not. But I'm not taking chances anymore. They gathered the children from the shed, Lila confused and whimpering, Ben wide awake and frightened, and brought them into the main house. Wyatt set them up in the bedroom, the only room with a heavy door that could be barred from inside. You stay here with them, he told Miriam. I'll keep watch from the kitchen. Anyone tries to come through that door, you shoot first and ask questions never. Understand? Miriam nodded, taking the rifle he pressed into her hands. Mama, what's happening? Ben whispered, his face pale in the lamplight. Some bad men came by, but Mr. Wyatt sent them away. We're just being extra careful now. Are they going to hurt us? Miriam looked at Wyatt, who met her gaze steadily. Not while I'm breathing, he said simply. Then he left, closing the door behind him. Miriam sat on the edge of the bed with her children pressed against her sides and the rifle across her knees. And she waited for dawn. It came slowly, gray and cold, and when Wyatt finally opened the door, his face was drawn with exhaustion, but his eyes were alert. They didn't come back. Miriam sagged with relief. What now? Now we do what we should have done from the start. He moved to the stove and started building a fire. We stopped waiting for them to make a move and start making moves of our own. What kind of moves? The kind that make it clear this isn't worth their time. He filled the coffee pot with water. Tucker and Boone are hired muscle. They get paid to intimidate people into paying debts, but they're not going to risk getting killed over one woman's husband's gambling money. We make it dangerous enough, expensive enough, they'll move on to easier targets. You sound very certain of that. I am. He set the pot on the stove. Men like them are bullies. They rely on people being too scared or too weak to fight back. You show them real resistance, they fold. Miriam wanted to believe him. And if they don't fold, Wyatt's expression was grim, then we deal with what comes. But one way or another, this ends. I'm not spending the rest of my life looking over my shoulder on my own land. That morning, after breakfast no one had much appetite for, Wyatt rode into town again. He was gone for hours, and Miriam spent the time trying to keep busy while terror gnawed at her insides. She worked in the garden, turning soil that was finally soft enough to plant, while Ben hauled rocks to reinforce the fence line, and Lila sat on the porch wrapped in a blanket. Every sound made Miriam jump. Every shadow looked like a man with a gun. When Wyatt finally returned, he wasn't alone. Sheriff Morrison rode beside him, and behind them came two other men, rough-looking ranchers with weathered faces and rifles across their saddles. Wyatt dismounted and introduced them. This is Carl Hayes from the next property over, and his brother Joseph. They're going to help us keep watch for the next few days. Carl, the older of the two, nodded at Miriam. Wyatt told us what happened. We don't take kindly to men threatening women and children around here. Besides, Joseph added with a grin that didn't quite reach his eyes, we owe Wyatt for helping us through the winter of '85. Time to return the favor. Morrison swung down from his horse. I'm staying too. If Tucker and Boone come back, I want to be here to arrest them proper. And if they try anything violent, well, he patted his rifle. We'll have plenty of witnesses to testify it was self-defense. Miriam felt tears prick her eyes. I don't know how to thank you all. This is... Don't need thanks, Carl said gruffly, just doing what neighbors do. They set up a watch rotation, 2 men awake at all times, positions covering all approaches to the property. Wyatt showed them the defensive preparations he'd made, and Morrison nodded approval. Good work. Place is a damn fortress now. He looked at Miriam. Mrs. Dale, you stay inside as much as possible. Don't make yourself a target. That night the house felt crowded but safer. Carl and Joseph took the first watch while Morrison and Wyatt caught a few hours of sleep. Miriam tried to rest but couldn't, her mind replaying every moment of the previous night's encounter. Around midnight, Ben crept out of the bedroom and found her sitting at the kitchen table. Can't sleep either, she asked softly. He shook his head and climbed into her lap, too big for it really, but still young enough to need the comfort. Mama, are we cursed? What? Papa died. And then those men came. And now Mr. Wyatt's in danger because of us. Maybe we're bad luck. Maybe everyone who tries to help us gets hurt." Miriam's heart shattered. She pulled her son close, pressing her face against his hair. "No, baby. No. We're not cursed. We just had some bad luck, that's all. And Mr. Wyatt, he's strong. He knows what he's doing. But what if something happens to him? What if those men—" "They won't. We have help now. The sheriff's here and Mr. Hayes and his brother. We're safe. But for how long?" Miriam didn't have an answer for that. The next 2 days passed in tense quiet. Tucker and Boone didn't return, but their absence felt more threatening than their presence. Like they were out there somewhere, waiting, planning. On the third day, Morrison got word from a contact in the nearest trading post. Tucker and Boone had been seen there, buying supplies and asking questions about the road north to Helena. "Could be they're giving up," Morrison said, though he didn't sound convinced. "Or could be they're trying to make us think they're leaving, so we let our guard down." "We don't let our guard down," Wyatt said flatly. "Not until we know for sure they're gone." But supplies and patience were both wearing thin. The Hayes brothers had their own ranch to run, and Morrison had other territories to patrol. They couldn't stay indefinitely. On the fourth day, Carl pulled Wyatt aside. Miriam couldn't hear their conversation, but she saw Wyatt's expression darken and Carl's apologetic shrug. Later, Wyatt found her in the garden. "Carl and Joseph need to head back. Spring planting season, and they've got their own work." "I understand." "Morrison's staying one more day, then he's got to move on too." Wyatt crouched beside her, watching her hands work the soil. "We'll be on our own again after that." Maybe they really have left. Maybe. He didn't sound like he believed it any more than she did. That night, after Carl and Joseph had ridden out and Morrison was on final watch, Miriam found herself unable to sleep again. She slipped out of the bedroom and found Wyatt sitting at the kitchen table, cleaning his rifle by lamplight for what must have been the 100th time. "Thought you were sleeping," he said without looking up. "Can't." She poured herself coffee from the pot that was always hot now. "Too much in my head." "Like what?" "Like guilt, like fear, like wondering if I made a terrible mistake bringing my children here." Wyatt set down the rifle and looked at her. "You didn't make a mistake." "How do you know?" "Because you're still alive. Your kids are still alive. You've got food and shelter and people willing to fight for you. That's not a mistake. That's survival." "But at what cost? You've barely slept in days. You've put yourself and your neighbors in danger. You've made a choice." He stood and moved to the window, looking out at the dark. "I chose to let you stay. I chose to defend this place. I chose to stand between you and those men. Nobody forced me. Nobody tricked me. I knew what I was doing. But why? Why take all this on when you could have just— because I was tired of being alone." The words came out rough, like they'd been scraped from somewhere deep. 6 years I've lived on this land by myself, working and sleeping and waking up to do it all again. No voice but my own, no reason to care whether the house was clean or the meals were decent or if I was even still alive, just existing. He turned to face her. "And then you showed up, half frozen and desperate, and suddenly this place felt like it had a purpose again. Like it mattered whether the roof leaked or the fence held because there were people here who needed it to hold." Miriam's throat was tight. "Wyatt, I'm not saying this to make you feel guilty," he continued. "I'm saying it so you understand that you didn't ruin my life by coming here. You gave it back to me. So stop apologizing. Stop thinking you're a burden. You're not." Miriam set down her coffee cup before she dropped it. "I don't know what to say." "Don't have to say anything." He moved back to the table and picked up his rifle. "Just accept it. Accept that maybe you're worth protecting. That maybe your kids are worth the trouble. That maybe—" He stopped himself, shaking his head. "Just accept it." Miriam crossed the room slowly, her heart pounding. She reached out and put her hand on his arm, feeling the solid warmth of him beneath the worn fabric of his shirt. "Thank you," she said quietly. "For everything. For seeing us as more than charity or obligation. For making us feel like we belong here." Wyatt looked down at her hand on his arm, then up at her face. For a moment, Miriam thought he might say something more. might give voice to the thing that had been building between them through the long winter, the careful distance that kept narrowing, the glances that lasted too long, the quiet understanding that felt like it had roots deeper than just gratitude. But he just nodded, the moment passing like morning mist, and went back to cleaning his rifle. Miriam returned to the bedroom, but she didn't sleep. She lay in the darkness with her children breathing softly beside her and thought about choices. About the choice to run from Kansas, to keep walking when her feet bled, to accept shelter from a stranger. About Wyatt's choice to help, to defend, to let 3 refugees occupy the edges of his carefully ordered solitude. About the choice she was starting to realize she wanted to make, to stay not because she had nowhere else to go, but because this harsh, beautiful, dangerous place had started to feel like home. Morrison left the next morning with promises to check back in a week. You have any trouble before then? Send word immediately. I'll come running. Appreciate it, Wyatt said, shaking his hand. After Morrison rode out, the ranch felt too quiet. Miriam and Wyatt worked through the day without talking much, both hyper-aware of every sound, every movement at the edge of vision. Ben stayed close to the house, his earlier eagerness to help replaced by watchful wariness. Lila sensed the tension and became clingy, refusing to let Miriam out of her sight. Night fell, and Wyatt took first watch. Miriam relieved him at midnight, and this time when she settled by the barn door with the rifle across her knees, she felt less terrified and more grimly determined. If Tucker and Boone came back, she wouldn't freeze. She wouldn't hesitate. She would protect what was hers. The thought surprised her. When had she started thinking of this place as hers? When had Wyatt's land and Wyatt's fight become something she had a claim to? Maybe around the same time Wyatt had started calling her by her first name instead of ma'am. Maybe when he'd carried Lila to bed with such careful gentleness. Maybe when he'd stood in front of Tucker's rifle and said, "She's under my roof," like it was a shield made of iron and faith. Miriam was still turning this over in her mind when she heard it. The soft nicker of a horse from somewhere beyond the property line. Not close, but not far enough away for comfort. She stood slowly, straining to see into the darkness. The moon was just a sliver tonight, offering almost no light, and clouds obscured even the stars. Another sound, the creak of saddle leather, a murmured voice quickly hushed. They were out there. Tucker and Boone, or men like them. Circling, watching, waiting for an opening. Miriam backed toward the house, her pulse hammering. She needed to wake Wyatt, needed to... The shot came from nowhere, shattering the silence and sending splinters flying from the barn wall 2 feet from where Miriam had been standing. She ran, not away from the house but toward it, dropping low as another shot kicked up dirt near her feet. She hit the porch at full speed, yanked open the door, and stumbled inside just as Wyatt came running from the bedroom, rifle in hand. "They're shooting," she gasped. "From the trees, I couldn't see them." Wyatt pushed her behind him and moved to the window, peering through the shutters. "How many?" "I don't know, at least 2. Another shot hit the house, the bullet punching through wood and embedding itself in the far wall. Lila screamed from the bedroom, and Ben's voice rose in fear. "Stay in there," Wyatt shouted. "Don't come out." He positioned himself at the window and returned fire, 3 quick shots into the trees. Miriam heard a yelp of pain, someone hit, but not fatally from the sound of it. "Get the other rifle," Wyatt ordered. "Cover the back door. They might try to circle around." Miriam grabbed the second rifle with shaking hands and moved to the kitchen, positioning herself where she could see the back approach. Her heart was hammering so hard she could barely hear over it, but her hands were steady on the weapon. More shots from outside, sporadic testing. They weren't trying to kill anyone yet, Miriam realized. They were trying to pin them down, to create panic and chaos. "Show yourselves, you cowards!" Wyatt shouted into the darkness. Tucker's voice came back, distant but clear. "Give us the woman, and we'll leave you alone." "Come get her, then." "Don't have to. We can wait you out, Carver. Eventually you'll run out of ammunition or water or just plain patience. And when you do, we'll be here." Wyatt fired again, and this time there was no yelp, just the sound of lead hitting tree bark. The shooting continued for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes. Miriam crouched by the back door, scanning the darkness, her finger on the trigger and her whole body vibrating with adrenaline. Then, as suddenly as it started, it stopped. The silence was worse than the gunfire. It's stretched taut and terrible, filled with possibility and threat. "They're gone," Miriam whispered. "Or they want us to think they are." Wyatt didn't move from his position. "Stay ready." They waited, straining to hear anything over their own breathing and the children's quiet crying from the bedroom. 5 minutes passed. 10. 20. Finally, Wyatt lowered his rifle slightly. "I think they really left this time. Probably didn't expect us to shoot back so hard." Miriam sagged against the wall, the rifle suddenly impossibly heavy. "What do we do now?" "Now we realize this isn't going to end until we make it end." He moved to the bedroom door and opened it. "Ben, Lila, you okay?" "We're scared," Ben's voice came back, small and shaking. "I know, but you're safe. The bad men are gone." "For now," Ben said, and the adult weariness in his young voice made Miriam want to weep. Wyatt closed the door gently and turned to Miriam. "We can't keep doing this. Can't keep waiting for them to attack, jumping at shadows, living in fear. It's no kind of life." "So what do we do?" His expression was hard, decided. "We stop playing defense. Tomorrow, we take the fight to them." "What does that mean?" "It means we track them down and end this, one way or another." He met her eyes. "You trust me?" Miriam thought about the past months, about the stranger who'd found them freezing behind a store and given them shelter without asking for anything in return, about the man who'd stood against armed thugs to protect people he barely knew, about the quiet strength and bone-deep decency she'd witnessed day after day. "Yes," she said, "I trust you." Good. He moved to the stove and started building up the fire. Because what comes next is going to take every bit of courage we've got. Miriam stood in the flickering lamplight, surrounded by the sounds of her frightened children and the smell of gunpowder still hanging in the air, and she made a choice. She'd run once from the men who wanted to destroy her. She wouldn't run again. Not from this place. Not from this man. Not from the life that was starting to take root here in the stubborn Montana soil. Whatever came next, they would face it together. And they would win. Dawn broke cold and clear, painting the Montana sky in shades of pink and gold that felt obscene against the violence of the night before. Miriam had managed maybe an hour of sleep, pressed against the bedroom wall with the rifle in her lap, and her children curled together on the bed. Every creak of the house had jerked her awake, every distant sound transformed by exhaustion into approaching footsteps. When pale light finally crept through the window, she found Wyatt already up, standing on the porch and studying the ground near the barn. She left the children sleeping and joined him, wrapping a shawl around her shoulders against the morning chill. "Found tracks," he said without preamble, pointing to churned mud at the property's edge. "2 horses, maybe 3, headed east toward the foothills." "Are you really going after them?" "We are." He turned to look at her. "Both of us. Can't leave you and the kids here undefended, and I need someone watching my back." Miriam's stomach clenched. "What about Ben and Lila?" "Carl Hayes owes me more than one favor. I'll send word for his wife Martha to come stay with them. She's got 5 kids of her own. 2 more won't make a difference, and she knows how to handle a rifle if it comes to that. Wyatt, I can't ask you to—" "You're not asking. I'm telling you how this is going to work." His voice was firm but not unkind. "Tucker and Boone know where we live. They know we're here. Long as that's true, we're targets. Only way to change that is to make them understand that coming after you costs more than any debt is worth. And if they don't understand, then we make sure they can't come back." The weight of what he wasn't saying hung between them. "Miriam, I need you to be clear-eyed about what we're doing. This isn't going to end with a polite conversation and handshakes. You understand that?" She met his gaze steadily. "I understand." "And you're willing to do whatever needs doing?" Miriam thought of Thomas, dead from fever while his gambling debts destroyed everything she'd built. Thought of walking 300 miles with starving children, of begging for work and being turned away, of hiding behind a store in a blizzard with nowhere left to run. Thought of Tucker's eyes traveling over her body like she was merchandise, of Boone's hungry stare, of bullets punching through the walls of the only place that had felt safe since her world fell apart. "Yes," she said. "I'm willing." Wyatt nodded once, satisfied. "Good. Get ready. We leave in an hour." Martha Hayes arrived before the sun was fully up, a solid woman in her 40s with kind eyes and capable hands. She took one look at Ben and Lila's frightened faces and pulled them both into a hug that seemed to ease something tight in their chests. "You two are going to help me bake bread today," she announced. "And Ben, I need someone strong to haul water. Think you can handle that?" Ben straightened, trying to look brave. "Yes, ma'am." "Mama, don't go," Lila whispered, clinging to Miriam's skirt. "Please don't leave us." Miriam knelt and cupped her daughter's face. "I have to, baby. But Martha's going to take good care of you, and Mr. Wyatt and I will be back before you know it." "What if you don't come back? What if those bad men will come back?" Miriam said it with more certainty than she felt. "I promise." She stood before the promise could crack under the weight of all the things that might make it a lie. Ben was watching her with eyes too old for his 9 years, and she saw him trying to be strong even though his hands were shaking. "Take care of your sister," she told him. "I will." His voice barely wavered. "And Mama, be careful." "Always am." She kissed them both and forced herself to walk away before the tears could come. Wyatt was already saddling his bay mare, and a smaller chestnut gelding he said was gentle enough for someone who hadn't ridden much. "You remember how to sit a horse?" he asked, checking the chestnut's girth. "It's been a while, but yes." He handed her the reins and studied her face. "You don't have to do this. You could stay with Martha and the kids. I can track them alone." "No." Miriam's voice was steel. "They came for me. This is my fight as much as yours." "All right then." He swung into his saddle with easy grace. "Stay close and do exactly what I say. These men are dangerous, and if things go bad, I need to know you'll follow orders without arguing. Can you do that?" "Yes." "Even if I tell you to run and leave me behind?" Miriam's jaw tightened. "Don't ask me to promise that." "Miriam!" "I said don't ask." She mounted the chestnut clumsily, her skirts tangling until she gave up and hiked them to her knees. "If things go that bad, we both run or we both fight. I'm not leaving you." Wyatt looked like he wanted to argue, but something in her expression must have convinced him it was pointless. Stubborn woman. Stubborn man. His mouth twitched in what might have been a smile if the situation wasn't so grim. "Fair enough. Let's go." They rode east, following the tracks through mud and new grass, past the property line and into territory Miriam had never seen. The land rolled in gentle swells, dotted with pine and aspen just starting to bud. Under different circumstances, it might have been beautiful. Wyatt rode with the easy confidence of someone who'd spent his life on horseback, his eyes constantly scanning the terrain ahead. Miriam did her best to keep up, her thighs already aching from the unfamiliar motion, her hands tight on the reins. They rode for 2 hours before Wyatt raised a hand, signaling her to stop. He dismounted and crouched near a stand of trees, examining the ground. "They stopped here," he said quietly. "Built a fire, looks like. Maybe spent what was left of the night." "How far ahead are they?" "Hard to say. Could be an hour, could be 3. He straightened and looked at the trail winding into the foothills. "They're heading toward the old mining camps. Probably figure they can lose us in the ravines up there." "Can they?" "Not if I can help it." He remounted and they continued, climbing now into rougher country where the trees grew thicker and the trail narrowed to barely a path. The sun climbed higher, warming the air, but not enough to chase away the chill that had nothing to do with temperature. Miriam's hands ached from gripping the reins, and her back screamed from the unfamiliar posture. But she didn't complain. Around midday, they crested a ridge, and Wyatt pulled up short. Below them, in a narrow valley between 2 hills, smoke rose from a campfire. And near that fire, 2 men stood arguing, Tucker and Boone, their voices carrying faintly on the wind. "There," Wyatt breathed. "Got them." He dismounted and helped Miriam down, then led the horses into cover behind a rocky outcrop. From there, they could see the camp clearly while remaining hidden. Tucker was pacing, gesturing angrily, while Boone sat on a log and cleaned his rifle. Even from this distance, Miriam could see the bandage on Boone's arm. Wyatt's bullet from last night had found its mark after all. "What do we do?" she whispered. Wyatt was silent for a long moment, thinking. "We could wait for them to sleep and take them then, or we could ride down there right now and end this face to face. What would you rather do?" Depends. He looked at her. How much mercy are you feeling today? Miriam thought about Lila's cough that had lingered for weeks, about Ben's hollow cheeks and frightened eyes, about the terror of bullets punching through walls while her children screamed, about every door that had been shut in her face, every person who'd looked at her like she was trash, every mile she'd walked with no destination except away. Not much, she said honestly. Wyatt nodded, something grim settling in his expression. Then we do this my way. He led her down the backside of the ridge, moving quietly through the trees until they were positioned above the camp. From here they had clear sight lines and the high ground, every advantage except numbers, though with Boone wounded, maybe that evened out. When I call out to them, you stay behind this tree and keep your rifle on Boone, Wyatt instructed. He's the dangerous one. Tucker's all talk, but Boone's got nothing to lose. If he reaches for his weapon, you shoot. Don't hesitate, don't think, just shoot. Understand? I understand. Good. He checked his rifle one last time. Whatever happens down there, remember, they came after us first. They shot at your children. You got nothing to feel guilty about. Before Miriam could respond, Wyatt stepped out from behind cover, his rifle aimed squarely at Tucker's chest. Morning, gentlemen, he called out, his voice carrying across the small valley. Nice day for a ride. Both men spun around, Tucker's hand going for his gun before he saw the rifle already trained on him. Boone froze, his eyes darting between Wyatt and the trees, clearly calculating whether he could reach his weapon in time. Carver! Tucker's voice was tight with anger and something that might have been fear. You're making a mistake. Am I? Because from where I'm standing, you're the ones who made the mistake. Coming to my land, threatening my people, shooting at my house. Wyatt took a step closer, his aim never wavering. That tends to make a man unfriendly. We were just trying to collect what's owed. Nothing's owed. The debt died with Thomas Dale, and even if it didn't, his widow isn't responsible for his gambling losses. You know that. The sheriff knows that. The territorial judge knows that. You're just too greedy to care. Tucker's jaw worked. Garrett won't let this go. You kill us, he'll send more men. Better men. Let him try. Wyatt's voice was cold. But I'm betting Garrett's not as invested in this as you think. He sent you two because you're expendable. Because if you succeed, he profits. And if you fail, he loses nothing but a couple of men who weren't worth much to begin with. Boone finally spoke, his voice tight with pain and rage. You shot me. You son of a... Should have aimed better. Would have saved us all this trouble. Wyatt gestured with his rifle. Both of you. Guns on the ground. Slow and easy. Tucker hesitated. And then what? You just let us walk away? That depends on what you do in the next 30 seconds. We could just shoot you right now, Boone said. 2 against 1, even wounded, I like those odds. Miriam stepped out from behind her tree, rifle raised and aimed at Boone's chest. 2 against 2, and I'm not wounded. Tucker's eyes widened. The woman. That's right. The woman you tried to intimidate. The woman whose children you terrorized. The woman who's got about 100 reasons to put a bullet in your skull right now. Miriam's voice shook slightly, but her aim stayed steady. So I'd think very carefully about your next move. Boone's hand twitched toward his gun, and Miriam's finger tightened on the trigger. For one breathless moment, she thought she was actually going to kill a man, could see the trajectory of the bullet, could imagine the impact, could feel the weight of that decision settling into her bones. But Tucker grabbed Boone's arm, stopping him. Don't be a fool. It's not worth dying over. The hell it isn't, Boone snarled, but he didn't draw. Wyatt moved closer, never lowering his rifle. Here's what's going to happen. You're going to write a letter to Silas Garrett saying that Miriam Dale is dead, died of fever or cold, or whatever you want to make up. Say you saw her buried. Say there's nothing left to collect and it's time to close the account. He'll want proof, Tucker said. Then make some up. You're good at lying. Shouldn't be hard. Wyatt's expression hardened. But if I ever hear that Garrett sent someone else after her, or if you two come within 100 miles of this territory again, I will hunt you down and finish what I started last night. And next time I won't aim for your arm. You can't make us write that letter, Boone said. Sure I can. Wyatt cocked his rifle, the click loud in the sudden silence. Write it or die. Your choice. Tucker and Boone exchanged glances. Miriam saw the calculation in their eyes, weighing pride against survival, greed against self-preservation. Finally, Tucker reached slowly into his coat and pulled out a small leather journal and a pencil. "Fine. You win." He wrote quickly, his hand shaking slightly, while Wyatt and Miriam kept their rifles trained. When he finished, he tore out the page and held it up. Wyatt took it, scanned the contents, then nodded. "Good enough. Now the guns. On the ground, both of you." They complied, moving slowly, their weapons clattering on the rocky soil. Wyatt kicked them away, then stepped back. "Get on your horses and ride west. Don't stop until you're in the next territory. And if I ever see either of you again, there won't be any talking, just shooting. We clear?" "Crystal," Tucker said through gritted teeth. They mounted up, Boone struggling with his wounded arm, and Wyatt watched them until they disappeared over the ridge. Only then did he lower his rifle, his shoulders sagging slightly with released tension. Miriam found herself shaking, the adrenaline that had kept her steady now draining away and leaving her hollow. The rifle suddenly weighed 1,000 pounds, and she had to set it down before she dropped it. "Is it really over?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Maybe. Maybe not." Wyatt tucked the letter into his coat. "I'll mail this from town. Make sure Garrett gets it. With any luck, he'll believe it and move on to easier marks. But we'll stay alert for a while, just in case." "Thank you." The words felt inadequate. "For everything. For standing with me. For Miriam." He turned to face her fully. "Stop thanking me. You would have done the same for me if the situation was reversed." "Would I? I don't know if I'm that brave." "You are." His voice was certain. "You walked 300 miles with 2 starving children and no destination. You stood behind that tree with a rifle aimed at a man who would have killed you without hesitation. You've survived things that would have broken most people. That's not luck or accident. That's courage." Miriam felt tears prick her eyes. "I don't feel courageous. I feel terrified most of the time." "That's what courage is. Being terrified and doing it anyway." He reached out and squeezed her shoulder briefly. "Come on, let's go home." The word settled over her like a blessing. Home. They rode back through the warming afternoon, the tension slowly leaking out of the silence between them. By the time they reached the ranch, the sun was starting its descent toward the western mountains, painting everything in shades of gold. Martha met them at the door, relief evident on her face. "Thank God. The children have been beside themselves." Ben and Lila came running, and Miriam barely had time to dismount before they were on her, hugging her with desperate strength. She knelt and wrapped her arms around them both, breathing in the scent of their hair and feeling their solid warmth against her chest. "It's over," she told them. "The bad men are gone. We're safe now." "Really?" Ben's voice was muffled against her shoulder. "Really, truly?" "Really, truly?" Lila pulled back to look at her face, searching for lies. "You promise?" "I promise." And this time Miriam believed it herself. Martha stayed for supper, chattering about her own children and the latest town gossip, and the normalcy of it felt surreal after the violence of the past days. But slowly, Miriam felt herself relax into it. The warmth of the kitchen, the smell of Martha's cornbread, the sound of children laughing instead of crying. After Martha left and the children were tucked into bed in the main house, neither would go back to the shed, and Wyatt had simply nodded and said that was fine. Miriam found herself alone with Wyatt in the kitchen. He was standing at the window, looking out at the darkening land, and something in his posture made her cross the room to stand beside him. "What are you thinking?" she asked. "That this place feels different now, fuller, somehow. Is that good or bad?" "Good." He glanced at her. "Definitely good." They stood in comfortable silence for a moment. Then Wyatt spoke again, his voice quiet. "I was thinking, if you wanted to stay past winter, past this trouble with Tucker and Boone, there's work here. More than one person can handle, really. I could use the help. And the kids, they're good kids. Be nice having young voices around the place again." Miriam's heart was suddenly pounding. "Are you asking us to stay permanently?" "If you want." He turned to face her fully. "I'm not good with words, Miriam. Never have been. But these past months, Having you here, it's made me remember what it feels like to care about something beyond just surviving day to day. And I'd like that to continue, if you would. Wyatt, her voice came out rough. Are you saying, I'm saying I want you to stay, not as hired help or charity, as, he paused, searching for words, as family, I guess. As people who belong here because this is home, not because they've got nowhere else to go. Miriam felt tears threatening again, but this time they were different, lighter. I don't know what to say. Say yes or say no, but say it honestly. She thought about Kansas, about the life she'd left behind in ashes and terror. Thought about the 300 miles she'd walked with no destination except away from pain. Thought about Ben's growing confidence, Lila's returning health, the way the land outside these windows had started to feel familiar instead of foreign. Thought about Wyatt, his steady presence, his quiet strength, the way he'd stood between her and danger without hesitation, the way he made her feel seen instead of invisible, valued instead of disposable. Yes, she said, we'll stay. Something in Wyatt's expression softened, a tension she hadn't realized he was carrying finally releasing. Good. That's good. They stood there in the lamplight, the moment stretching between them, and Miriam realized with startling clarity that this was the beginning of something. Not just survival, not just refuge, but the first tentative steps toward building something real and lasting. Wyatt seemed to realize it too, because he cleared his throat and took a small step back. You should get some rest. Been a long day. So should you. I will. Just want to check the barn first, make sure everything's locked down. He left, and Miriam stood alone in the kitchen, her heart full of something she couldn't quite name, but felt warm and solid and startlingly like hope. The weeks that followed settled into a new rhythm, one that felt less temporary and more permanent with each passing day. Spring came on strong, transforming the brown landscape into an explosion of green. The garden that Miriam planted flourished under her care, and Ben took responsibility for weeding and watering with a dedication that made her chest tight with pride. Lila's health continued to improve until the cough disappeared entirely, and the child spent her days running through the property, chasing chickens and collecting wildflowers and filling the air with laughter that had been absent for too long. Wyatt taught Ben how to ride properly, how to mend tack, how to read the weather and the land. He was patient in a way Miriam hadn't expected, explaining things multiple times without frustration, praising effort as much as success. And slowly, carefully, the careful distance between Miriam and Wyatt began to narrow. It happened in small ways. A hand on her back as he passed in the kitchen, his coat draped over her shoulders when the evening turned cold, the way his eyes lingered on her face during meals, the way her heart jumped when she heard his voice, the way she found excuses to work near him during the day. One evening in late May, after the children were asleep and the dishes were done, Wyatt asked her to walk with him. They strolled to the ridge that overlooked the property, watching the sun set in a blaze of orange and purple. I've been thinking, Wyatt said, his voice quiet, about how to make this arrangement more official. Miriam's breath caught. Official how? Well, he looked uncomfortable but determined. The way I see it, you're already part of this place. You work the land, you care for the animals, you've made this house feel like a home instead of just a building. Seems wrong that you don't have any legal claim to it. Wyatt, I don't need... Let me finish. He turned to face her fully. I'm not good at this, at talking about feelings or making pretty speeches, but I need you to know that when I said I wanted you to stay, it wasn't just because you're good help. It's because... He paused, struggling. Because I've spent 6 years being alone, and I don't want to be alone anymore. Not when I could have you and those kids here instead. Not when I could have a family again. Miriam's throat was tight. Are you asking me to marry you? Eventually, maybe, if you'd want that. He reached out and took her hand, his calloused fingers gentle against hers. But right now, I'm just asking if you can see a future here. A real future, not just surviving day to day. Can you see that? Miriam looked out over the land, the fields they'd planted together, the fences they'd mended, the house that had sheltered them through the hardest winter of her life. She thought about Ben's laughter when Wyatt showed him how to rope a post, about Lila falling asleep in Wyatt's arms after dinner, about the way this hard, lonely man had opened his life to make room for 3 desperate strangers. "Yes," she said softly. "I can see that." Wyatt's hand tightened around hers. "Good. That's real good." They stood there as the sun slipped below the horizon, and Miriam felt something settle in her chest, a certainty she hadn't felt since before Thomas died, maybe even before that. A sense that she was exactly where she was supposed to be, with exactly who she was supposed to be with. It wasn't love yet, not the wild romantic kind from stories, but it was something steadier, something that felt like it could grow into something even better. It was partnership and respect and shared purpose. It was choosing each other not out of desperation, but out of hope. It was enough. More than enough. The summer passed in a blur of work and growth. The garden produced more vegetables than they could eat, so Miriam learned to can and preserve, filling the cellar with jars for winter. The herd of cattle Wyatt managed grew stronger, and he hired 2 ranch hands to help with the work, young men from town who treated Miriam with respectful courtesy and taught Ben even more about ranching. In July, Sheriff Morrison stopped by with news that Silas Garrett had closed Miriam's account, officially declaring Thomas Dale's debts uncollectible. "Looks like your letter worked," he told Wyatt. "You're in the clear." In August, Father Greaves from the church in town rode out to meet with Wyatt and Miriam privately. They talked for a long time, and when the priest left, Wyatt had a strange look on his face, nervous but determined. That evening, after supper, he asked Ben and Lila to come sit with him and their mother at the table. "Got something I want to talk to you both about," he said, looking uncharacteristically uncomfortable. "I've been thinking, well, your mama and I have been talking, and we think—" "Are you going to marry Mama?" Lila interrupted, her eyes bright. Wyatt blinked. "How did you—" "Because you look at her the way Papa used to look at her, and she smiles different now, happy different." Ben nodded seriously. "I think you should marry her. Then we could really be a family." Wyatt looked at Miriam, something warm and surprised in his eyes. "Well, guess that makes this easier." He turned back to the children. "Would you 2 be all right with that? With me marrying your mama and us all living here together permanent-like?" "Yes!" Lila launched herself at Wyatt, wrapping her small arms around his neck. "Can I call you Papa?" Wyatt's expression cracked, emotion flooding through the careful control he usually maintained. "Yeah, sweetheart. You can call me Papa if you want." Ben stood more carefully, offering his hand like a man instead of a boy. "Thank you for taking care of us, Mr. Wyatt, for protecting Mama and Lila, for teaching me things and not making me feel like a burden." Wyatt shook his hand solemnly. "You've never been a burden, Ben. Any of you. You've been the best thing to happen to this ranch in years." Later, after the children were in bed and Miriam and Wyatt were alone again, he pulled her close for the first time, a careful embrace that felt like coming home. "You sure about this?" he asked quietly. "Marrying me means tying yourself to this hard life, this hard land. Means accepting that I'm not always easy to live with, that I'm set in my ways and probably too old to change much." Miriam pulled back to look at him. "Wyatt Carver, in the past 6 months you've shown me more kindness, more respect, and more genuine care than I received in 6 years of marriage to Thomas. You've protected my children, given us a home, and asked for nothing but honest work in return. You are not hard to live with. You're the easiest thing in my life right now. Still," he touched her face gently, "want you to be sure." "I'm sure." She covered his hand with hers. "I choose this. I choose you. I choose this life we're building together." Wyatt kissed her then, careful and sweet and full of promise, and Miriam felt the last piece of her broken heart slide back into place. They married in September, in the small church in Ashford, with Martha Hayes and Sheriff Morrison as witnesses and Ben and Lila standing proud beside them. Miriam wore a simple blue dress Martha had helped her sew, and Wyatt wore his best shirt with his hair slicked back and his hands shaking slightly when he slid the ring onto her finger. Father Greaves pronounced them husband and wife, and when Wyatt kissed her, Ben cheered and Lila clapped and Martha cried happy tears. The reception was held at the ranch, with neighbors Miriam barely knew bringing food and gifts and well wishes. Carl Hayes shook Wyatt's hand and said, "About damn time you found yourself a good woman." Joseph played fiddle while children danced in the yard, and as the sun set on their wedding day, Miriam stood on the porch of what was now legally her home and felt complete in a way she'd never experienced before. Wyatt came to stand beside her, watching the celebration. "You happy?" he asked. "Yes." She leaned against his solid warmth. "Are you?" "More than I thought possible." He wrapped an arm around her. "Thank you for staying, for giving this place, giving me a chance. Thank you for finding us that night, for not just riding past when you could have. Best decision I ever made." They stood together as darkness fell and the stars came out, and Miriam thought about the journey that had brought her here. 300 miles of walking, countless doors shut in her face, a blizzard that had nearly killed them all. Men with guns and threats, fear so deep it had become a constant companion. But also, the stranger who'd offered shelter without asking for anything in return. The land that had revealed its harsh beauty slowly, season by season. The children who'd found strength she hadn't known they possessed. The man who'd chosen to stand with them even when it would have been easier to turn away. She'd left Kansas running from death and debt and despair. She'd found Montana, found Wyatt Carver and his lonely ranch, and discovered that sometimes the end of one story was just the beginning of another. The hard winter was behind them now. Spring had come and gone. Summer had blazed and faded, and autumn was painting the mountains gold. And ahead lay more seasons, more years, more of this life they were building together from honest work and shared purpose, and something that was growing every day into love. It wasn't the life Miriam had imagined when she married Thomas all those years ago. It was harder in many ways. The work was endless, the weather unforgiving, the isolation sometimes overwhelming. But it was theirs. Built by their own hands, defended by their own courage, sustained by their choice to keep choosing each other every single day. Wyatt squeezed her shoulder gently. "Come on, Mrs. Carver. Let's go thank our guests." Mrs. Carver. The name fit like it had always belonged to her. They walked back into the celebration together, and Miriam smiled at the people who'd become her neighbors, her community, her new family. Ben was teaching one of Carl's sons how to rope a fence post, his movements confident and sure. Lila was dancing with Martha's youngest daughter, her laughter bright and clear and completely unshadowed by the fear that had haunted her for so long. This was what survival looked like on the other side of suffering. Not just staying alive, but actually living. Not just enduring, but flourishing. Not just making it through one more day, but looking forward to all the days that would come after. The night deepened, and the celebration continued, and Miriam Dale Carver stood in the center of her new life and felt, for the first time in longer than she could remember, truly at peace. The bad men were gone. The debts were settled. The winter had been survived. And here, on this hard, beautiful land, with this hard, beautiful man, and these resilient, precious children, she had finally found home.